Hey guys, welcome to the Beginner's Guide to Learning 3D Modeling in Maya. For this tutorial, I'm assuming people are new to 3D and also Maya. We're going to be making this very simple thumbtack. This is a great object if you are new to modeling because it's relatively easy, but it also will teach you a lot of fundamental skills that can be used to model almost anything that you can think of. If you learn how to make this, you can also learn how to make more advanced props, weapons, vehicles. You can make characters, creatures, and more. You can make almost anything you can think of if you become proficient in polygon modeling. As a VFX artist and supervisor, I've worked on a lot of great films over the years. And 3D modeling has always been the background of my skill set. This allowed me to not only have a career as a modeler, but also to work in other disciplines such as texture, groom, look dev, also rigging, effects, lighting, and overall CG supervision, looking after shots and sequences for the entire pipeline. So again, this is our thumbtack. We're going to go over the interface really quickly and then get into modeling, and we'll also cover UVs. And it's a very simple asset, but we will complete it in a similar way that you would in a VFX studio. So thanks again, and I hope you enjoy the tutorial. All right. When we open Maya for the first time, we can see the Maya interface. And for modeling, there's a number of windows in here that we use primarily. One of the main windows is the outliner. This is a list of objects in your scene. Right? So if you create objects like a sphere, they will show up in here and they'll have a name. You can also create groups and hierarchies in here, and you can rename things. So the outliner is very important. If you ever lose it, there's a button over here where you can get it back. You can also dock windows if you drag them there. So the interface is very flexible. And another main menu is the attribute editor. So the attribute editor allows you to change aspects of your selection. So there's tabs in here, and you can control all sorts of parameters and attributes for objects. That's the attribute editor. Another one is the channel box. So the channel box displays a lot of the same information as the attribute editor, but it has a different layout. It gives you the transform info. And then it lists your shapes and your inputs. The inputs are the history of the object. Right? So this will contain the initial creation. Right? So I created the sphere, and it has some attributes in here, such as the subdivisions. And then when you perform operations like an extrude, there you go. Your history will now contain this extrude node. Right, so that's the channel box. Another important window is the modeling toolkit. This has a lot of modeling tools, and this is extremely useful. You can switch back and forth to different components, right, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then there's some very useful modeling tools in here, as well as a custom shelf. It's the modeling toolkit. Another one is the UV toolkits. We'll talk about this later when we go over UVs. And there's a handy menu up here called Workspace. So by default, you get Maya Classic. So if I reset this, this should be what you see by default. All right, so Maya Classic has a timeline, your outliner. It has the channel box, attribute editor, modeling toolkits, and UV toolkits. If you want to customize your interface, you can save your current workspace as. All right, so you can make a custom one. You can also switch over to one of the modeling workspaces that come with Maya. So modeling standard gives you a little more room to work with, gets rid of the timeline. And again, you can drag these windows around however you like. You can use two monitors. You can leave them floating. Also, if you go to the top and go to display, and also windows, there are some settings in here where you can control which elements are displayed. So, for instance, if you want to hide the timeline, you can hide this. Right, so that's time slider, range slider. There's a command line, help line. The toolbox is over here. This is there's selection and then move, rotate, and scale. There's also some UI things in here, right? So there's you can display the grids. And then the heads-up display has, camera name, and then object details is very useful. And there's poly count, which is a good one. So these are some of the ways you can customize the interface. And for modeling, typically what we want is an outliner, viewports, and then the channel box, attribute editor, modeling toolkits, and UV toolkit. I'd like to talk briefly about cameras. By default, if you look at the outliner, you'll see a perspective camera, which is your default viewport here. And then you'll see top, front, and side. But the perspective viewport is a camera that's similar to an actual camera lens. By default in Maya, this is a 35 millimeter focal length. And if you create something like a box or a cylinder, you can see that there is perspective. If you were to extend these lines into infinity, they would reach a vanishing point. Right, so this is a perspective camera. Now, if you hit spacebar, you can go, or there's buttons over here. So if you go to a quad view, you'll see perspective, top, front, and side. These top, front, and side views are called orthographic cameras. And you can see the difference here if we look at our two objects that we've created. There isn't any perspective distortion, and there's no vanishing point, right? So these two edges, we can visualize this a little more if I extend this face really far. If we look at the perspective view, you can see that eventually these two lines converge into a vanishing point. But if we look at our orthographic view, we get completely straight lines. And that's an orthographic camera. The closest thing to a real world camera would be if you had an infinitely long lens. Right? So instead of 1,000 or a 2,000 millimeter lens, it would just be an infinitely long focal length. So that is an orthographic view. And these are very useful when you are modeling to reference. And if you want to view something straight on, if you want to align things to a grid, if you want to make sure that two components are perfectly parallel, these orthographic views are very useful. You can also create new cameras in Maya. So again, if you hit spacebar, you can maximize any of these viewports. And if you go to perspective, we can create a new camera a number of ways. One way is if you go to this thing that says panels, and then perspective, and then new, you can create a new camera that way, right? So we can see in the camera name down here, this is called perspective 1. And it created a new camera in the outliner. And this one's not hidden, that's why it's white. Right, so you can give it a name. So camera 2. And if we look at it, we can see it, if I go side by side, again, under panels, you can select which camera you look through. So now under perspective, we have this camera 2. So we can look through there. And if I go to perspective here, we can now work with 2 different cameras, and we can see this is the camera that we just created. So there's a film camera icon. And if we select it in the viewports, in the attribute editor, you can see all the parameters for this, like the focal length. So if we want, we could change this. Maybe we want a 50. All right, so that'll change the focal length. If you hit F, you can frame a selection. And then if you hit home, you can go back to the default view. If you look at the top of the interface, there are a number of menus. And the main ones that we use for modeling are Mesh, Edit Mesh, and Mesh Tools. And if you click on the top bar here, you can tear off the menu, which is very useful. So under Mesh, this contains tools or operations. Right? So each one of these performs an action on geometry. And these are organized in these menus, which represent different categories, right? So if I just create a sphere here, the mesh menu contains operations that, for the most part, operate on the geometry as a whole, right? So for instance, if you triangulate, that will operate on the entire mesh. The Edit Mesh menu contains operations that operate on components, which we'll explain more in a moment. But for instance, if we select a face, we can hit Extrude. And that is an operation that is applied to a face, which is a component of a mesh. Mesh Tools, this menu contains tools that are in the modeling toolkit here. So if you look at these, this is mostly what you find over here as well. So in Maya, you'll find the same tools and operations in many different places, right? So there's the top menus, there's the modeling toolkits, there's also marking menus, right? So if you hit Shift and right-click, you can find tools in here. You can use tools by hitting hotkeys, right? So that's another way. Also, if you hit spacebar, you can access menus through this. This is called the hotbox. So Maya has lots of ways to access modeling tools. And most people sort of figure out their own preferences for that. I typically use the modeling toolkit and also a custom shelf. I wanted to talk more about components. So if we create an object, let's create a box. We can see, a box or a cube shape. And in 3D and polygon modeling, this is called geometry. And then the geometry is made up of components, right? So the components are faces, right? So this is a face. A box is made up of 6 faces. There's also points, or in Maya, these are called vertices, right? So this is a vertex. Here. There's also edges, right? So this is an edge. And you can access these by right-clicking. So if you right-click, there's this, this menu here. So if you right-click and drag, you can get to edge, vertex, and face. So this is a very, very useful way to switch between your component modes. Right, so if I select face, I can go to face mode, and then you can make selections, and you can move things around. Right. The other way to switch is you can use the modeling toolkit over here. So at the very top, there's buttons here for, this is object selection. Right, so this selects the entire object. There's vertices, edges, and face. So this is just another way to select, to go into that selection mode. All right, now that we've gone over the interface, we can jump in and get started modeling. So one of the cool things you can do as a 3D modeler is sort of just pick out everyday objects and you can make them in 3D. So for this tutorial, I tried to find the simplest thing I could possibly find. And I came up with the humble thumbtack. So this is a thumbtack image that I got off the web. You could also take your own photograph of one. And you want to store your image, right? So this is the original image I got. And usually you want to process this a little bit. So what I've done is taken it into Photoshop and just straightened it a little bit, and then it was a bit blown out, so I lowered the exposure. So we now have this this reference image, and there's a couple ways to use this in modeling. Reference is very important for modeling because we can really get those realistic details that we find in real-world objects. So one way you can use this is with a program called PureRef. So this is PureRef here. This is a window. And if I can expand this, PureRef gives you an infinite canvas where you can zoom into different different images. And it's always on top. So if you sort of just position this where you want it, you can have your reference here. And this is really nice when you're modeling something by eye. Another way to use reference is with a reference plane within Maya. And my PureRef disappeared. So if you right-click in PureRef and go to mode, you can do always on top. So to create a reference plane in Maya, you can go to the Create menu up here. And you can create this free image plane. So this is an object, and it shows up in the outliner here. So this is image plane 1. And if we go to our attribute editor, we can plug in our reference image file. So if we click on this folder icon, by default, it opens the source images folder. But this is actually saved in a different folder. So you just have to find your image and plug it in. And I've saved this out as a square image, so by default it comes in undistorted, which is nice. You can change the size. If you have a non-square image, you might have to put in the size here. This is the channel box. Now that we have our reference, we can begin modeling. if we want, we can reposition this image plane. So we can bring it up a little bit like so. And whenever we start modeling an object, it's always good to sort of break this down into parts, right? So obviously we have the metal piece here. This is the metal tack. And then there's a clear plastic handle. Right? So there's two main pieces of that. So we can sort of plan to build those two pieces. And then the main shapes here that we see are actually cylinders. So we can know that if we create cylinders, those can be good starting points or building blocks towards creating that this object. So let's go ahead and do that. We can create a cylinder. So I have, again, this is a custom shelf, and I have a button here to create a cylinder. So this comes in at origin. And by default, this thing has 16 subdivision axes, right? So if you select all these edges, and if you go to the modeling toolkit, it'll give you a count, right? So this has 16 edges. And what we can do is just kind of think about that for a moment. And if you click this little button here, you'll get X-ray. And then this one here goes into isolate. So if you need to see your object without the image plane, you can use isolate. Or you can select your image plane and hide it. That's another way. But let's just take a look at this cylinder. So whenever you create one of these, you want to think carefully about how many subdivisions it has or how many edges it has around here. And it's really nice to make sure that you have an edge on each axis, right? So you can see the axes here in red. So this is Z here, and X goes across this way. If you look in the bottom left corner of your window, you can see the XYZ, so Y goes up. And this cylinder, if I go to my channel box, so this has 16 subdivisions, right? So that's very useful because we get one on each axis, and then also we get one in the middle, right? So if we look at top view, so if I hold down space, we can go to top. And you can see that clearly here, right? So we have edge loops or edges on each axis, and then also one halfway in between, right? So this is a 45 degree angle. So 16 is pretty good. You know, you can do 8, right? So if you get 8, you just get this one. Right? You could also do, 32 is a good one. 64 is fine. But for this, I think 16 is probably okay. So we'll do 16. And then if I bring back my image plane, we can start with the handle. So we have a cylinder, and if I just bring this up, we can sort of bring it up to where the handle starts. And then I can scale it up to the top. And I'm going to show you a couple ways to model this, right? So this is starting with a full cylinder. And again, if we go to X-ray mode, we can see through, which is nice. And you can use perspective, or you can go to, you can actually go to the front view. And we can start by just kind of scaling this to the largest point. And then if I scale in Y, we can sort of get it down here. So that's kind of like the blocking shape. And then in order to get this to match the profile, we can use some of the tools found in the modeling toolkit. Right? So one really important tool is multicut. So if you select this, you get this, this tool handle. And the way this works is you can manually insert edges on your mesh, right, by using this tool. Once you have your edges, you can right click and then drag up, and that'll complete the tool. So what we did is we just inserted these edges. Right. If you want to delete them, you can hit delete, but you have to remember to delete your points as well. Right, so you can select them and then hit delete again. Or if I undo that, if I want to delete these and the points, you can hit Control and then delete, and that will delete your points as well. Another function of the multi-cut tool is to insert edge loops. So if you hold Control, you get a preview of where your loop will be. And if you move your mouse cursor around, you can get that sort of where you want it. And this is a very useful modeling technique. Right, so these are edge loops. And if you double click, you can select the edge loop. And again, we can shift click, get all these. And if I hit Control Delete, we can delete them. And I'll just go back to front view, right? So again, I'll select our object, go to multi-cut. And we want to insert edge loops that line up to the profile of the object. Right, so we'll put one here and one here, and then maybe one up here. And then at this point, we can start shaping the objects to match the reference. So if I go into vertex mode, I can select all of these here. And then we can scale until they roughly match the size of the object at this point. All right, so just do the same thing. And I'm clicking here on the middle, and that's going to do a uniform scale. And if we look at that in perspective, what we're doing is scaling it uniformly. What you don't want to do is accidentally sort of scale it along one axis. You can also use this box here. So that scales it along X and Z. Right. So we can sort of line that up, and then this one goes even further in. So. And we notice the thumbtack isn't perfectly aligned. And that's okay, because real objects are not perfect. If we look at this thing, we can see that it's just a little bit wonky, right? It's not a perfectly symmetrical object. So I think for this, I'm just going to line it up to what we see. And that actually adds a lot of realism to your modeling if you do that. Scale these in. So, and we need another edge loop in here. So I'll go back to the multi-cut and cut that in. And we'll try to just roughly match the outline. So we now have a rough shape. Again, we can see through this because I have X-ray mode on. So if we turn that off and if we hide our image plane, you can hide by hitting H. You can see here we already have a pretty good approximation of the handle of this thumbtack. There are some display options that can help with this. So what we're seeing is a smooth normal, right? So the normal is the way that the shape of an object is displayed in the viewport. Right, so this is a smooth normal. On my shelf, I have some shortcuts here. If we set this to hard, we can see our hard face edges. There's another one that's very useful for modeling, which is to set it to an angle. So if we hit this button, we'll get an angled normal. Right, so this is a 30-degree normal. And that means that edges like this are made hard, but edges like these are soft, and that's determined by the angle of the normal or the edges on the face. I wanted to show an alternate way to create this this object. It's an alternate kind of technique for modeling. So if I just hide this, and I'll show the image plane again. So another way to create this is I'll grab a cylinder and move it up, similar to what we did last time. But instead, I'll just delete everything but the top. All right, so I went into face mode, selected everything but the top, and hit delete. All right, so that just leaves us with the top. So I can position this. You can see our pivot point is wrong. If you want to fix that, you can go to Modify and then Center Pivot. I have a shelf button for that, so I can center. And then I'll go ahead and move this up. And we can go to Front View. And we'll just start here. So I'll scale it up a bit. And then what we can do is select the edges that go around the perimeter here, and we want to extrude these down. So one way to do that is in modeling toolkits, we can hit extrude, and we get this this manipulator, and we can drag these down. Right? And if I go back to front view and X-ray, we can drag it down, and then we can also scale it this way. And then we can extrude again, right? So I still have this selected, right? So we can hit extrude, and we can use the manipulator, or if I hit W, it'll switch to move, and then we can move this down here, and then scale it in. And then we want to just keep extruding until we get to the end. Right, so I can keep hitting this button. Another shortcut is if I hold down Shift, you'll see it says extrude. And we can just drag down this one. And that's kind of a fast way to extrude. So I'll move this down here. And it doesn't have to be perfect because we can adjust this later, but we'll just keep extruding. Right, we can move it back up if we want. Right, and just keep extruding. So that's kind of an alternate way to do this. To close this hole at the bottom, you can select all of these. And you can extrude, and then if you hit R and scale, you can scale these in. And then another way to do this is you can extrude, and then there's this. If you go to Edit Mesh, I'll have to find this in here. You can do Merge to Center. And that will merge all those edges into a single point right here. Another way to do it is if I delete those. You can select all of these and then do Mesh and then Fill Hole. Right, so that'll give you a single polygon. And this is what we call an n-gon. So an n-gon is a face that has more than 4 sides. right? So a 3-gon would be a triangle, a 4-gon is a polygon, and then a 5 or 6 or whatever gon is an n-gon. And n-gons are not good. We tend to not like these in modeling. So we always want to get rid of our n-gons. And we can see this one if I go to the edge perimeter. And to access that menu, I'm holding Control and then right click, and then I go up to edges and then edge perimeter. This is a polygon that has 16 edges. Right, so what we want to do is collapse these down to a point. And there's a tool for that, which is called poke face. Yeah, poke. It's kind of funny. So if we poke that, you'll get all these that have been sort of merged together and forming a point, and then triangles. So, those are some different ways to close that hole. All right, now that we have a blocking shape for the objects, we can do what's called refining. So refinement would be looking for areas where we haven't quite described the curvature and the shape of the object, right? So this would be an example here where this edge is more round, right? So we can keep adding edge loops for this, right? So if I add maybe a couple more in here, we can position like so. If you see how this middle box is yellow on the manipulator, if you middle click and drag, you can scale without having to actually use your pointer and position it directly on here. So if you middle click, it's actually a bit easier to do this. And again, if you double click, you can select your edge loop, and then I'm hitting R to scale. And we can scale up our edge loops. This one can go down a little bit because we have more edge loops. All right. There's a similar story here. And if we look at the edge, this is a relatively flat surface, right? So if we look here, it's a flat sort of disc that makes up the bottom of the cylinder. But what you see here is that there's a curvature on the edge, and this is what we call a bevel. So for the real object, this piece of plastic was made, using industrial methods like injection molding. And what you find is that you won't get any edge that's a perfect sort of 90-degree angle. Right, so when we look at our edge, and I'll just isolate this. This is a very sort of CG perfect edge. And what we want to do is bevel that so we get this kind of curvature here. So what we can do is, again, double click here, and we can use the bevel tool. So if I click that, we get this little window that has some different options, and we can control the fraction here. And by default, it's kind of hard to control, but if you click this blue circle here, to where it's like that, that will make it less sensitive. All right. So what you can see here is that this is the original edge. And as we raise the fraction, the edges slide. Right? So if you raise it all the way to 1, it's going to hit the next edge. And if you do 0.5, it'll be halfway in between. So what we want to do is just sort of tweak this until it matches the profile. Right? So I'll go back to front view, and go out of isolate, and go into X-ray. And if I tweak this, we can kind of get that bevel to be similar to what we see in the image. Like so. And once we do that, we can manually change this as well, right? So if I double click here, Again, being careful not to scale this way. Right, so scaling this way. We can line it up even more closely. So that's our beveled edge on the bottom. And we can do the same thing here. This is a pretty sharp edge, but there is a little bit of bevel there. All right, so it's a smaller bevel. And if we select our edge loop, so I'm double clicking, and then we can bevel. And if you hold down Control, you'll get more control over this, right? So if you just do this, it's fast. If you Control, click, and drag, you can sort of fine tune. And you can also middle click and drag this, right? So as long as you have it selected here. So we'll get a finer bevel. So, and we can move these around, right? So let's move it down a little bit. And maybe scale it in. You can uniform scale this, but these edges will get a little closer together. Another way is you can scale this way. Right? Or you can Control drag on the y-axis, and that'll scale along X and Z. So there's lots of different ways to kind of control your scale here. Also, if you go to the modeling toolkit, you can see in the scale settings which axis this is on. So if you click here, you get all three, and then you can scale this. All right, so we've lined that up. We could also look at this side as well, right? So we lined up the rights. Since we don't care if this object is symmetrical, we can line up the lefts as well. All right, so I'll line this up and scale it. And same here. All right. And then we can just continue sort of refining. So we'll do door bevel here at the top. And this is a little less sharp than the one at the bottom. And if you wanted to, you can add more segments as well. A lot of times you want to use an odd number for the most part. So if you set it to 2, you get the one in the middle and then one on either side. And that's usually a good setting to go for. All right, so there's our top. And then if we look at the this part up here, this has a pretty good kind of curvature to it. So we'll bevel this guy. And we can definitely see a lot of sort of irregularity to this area. So if I go into vertex mode, we can kind of move this around. So I'm moving and scaling. We might even rotate this, right? So if I hit E, we can rotate. So maybe the mold was a little bit off in this area. So we can kind of line that up. And this will actually give your model a nice kind of realistic look to it because it's not perfect. So there's that piece. And then the very top is beveled as well. All right, so if we double click, we'll get that loop at the top here. All right, so again, we can apply our bevel. kind of guess a little bit at how that's how much bevel that has. And what we're seeing here in the image is that this was taken with a camera or a phone that has a lens. And so what we're seeing here is we're seeing the bottom of this face as well as the top up here. And that's the difference between an orthographic view and a regular camera. Right? So when we're looking at the front view, this is orthographic. If we go to our perspective, that actually has this kind of perspective distortion. So we're not going to, in orthographic view, this is going to be perfectly straight, and it's not going to line up to the image exactly. So a lot of times we just have to sort of find an in-between or eyeball where we think these edges are. So I think we'll do just something like that. All right, so we can kind of take a look at our object, right? So if we hide our image plane and go out of X-ray, we can just take a look. So this is our thumbtack handle. And again, we talked about normals. Since we beveled these edges, we don't need to have a hard edge here, right? So this happened when we were using the bevel tool. So we can display this a little better, right? So if we select here and do angle, that will give you a good sort of accurate appearance. The other thing we can do is, since we beveled these, we can just make everything soft. And that'll give you a pretty accurate, kind of smooth look to the model. Another thing we can notice about the top is that I actually have a thumbtack here, and there's a little bit of depression here. So if we want to create that on the top, what we can do is insert another edge loop. And one way to do that is the multi-cut's not going to work with these triangles. So what you can do is just make one here. And then just select all these and scale them. Right? And then you can kind of move this down a little bit. And you get something like a dished out surface. Another thing we can notice here is that we're still seeing, even though we've smoothed the normals, we can still see the polygon faces. Right? So if you look here, we're actually seeing the polygons. And when we're modeling for film, usually what we do is something called subdivision at render time. And that smooths the surface to get the final result. So if you select this and hit 3 on your keyboard, what we get is a smooth preview. Right, so this is a preview of how your object will look when we actually render it. And what it's doing here is it's actually subdividing the model, but it's just doing it as a preview. Right, so the other way to do this is if you go to Mesh and then Smooth. Right, we can see that this operation actually adds geometry. Right, so this is a single division. If you do 2, you get even more density. And then 3 would be even more than that. But we don't want to do this when we're modeling. What we want to do is have a relatively simple geometry, and then we subdivide at render time. And that gets us this nice smooth curvature. So I can undo that, or the best way to get rid of that smooth is to go to the channel box, and we can see all the history here. These are all the modeling operations that we've done. So the last one is this poly smooth face. And if I select this here, you can go to Edit and then Delete Node. And that'll just get rid of that smooth. And again, if we hit 3, this is essentially giving us the preview of that smooth operation, but it's not baking it into our mesh. This is something that happens at render time. So, if you hit 1, it'll go back to the regular display. 2 gives you a cage, right? So this gives you a display of, this is the actual geometry, and then that's the smoother version is the smooth preview. So that's 2, 1, and then 3. Okay, so we have our handle, and the next thing we can do is start on the tack. All right, so the tack is this metal piece, and if you look carefully, it's not just this spike. There's a head at the top. All right, so this kind of flat cylinder. So we'll go ahead and start this with a cylinder. All right, so again, I have a shelf here which has this button, so I can click this. Another way to do it is if you go to Create and then Polygon Primitives, there's a cylinder, right? It's the same thing. This is the interactive creation, right? So you can create this by dragging on the grid. So that's another way. You can also do it using this hotbox by pressing space. You can create. But I really like these shelf buttons, so let's do that. And we can bring our reference back. So if I hit Shift H, we'll unhide that. And here we go. And let's go to front view. All right, so we can scale our cylinder. And again, we're using a 16-sided cylinder. So I'm going to scale this up. And then we want to make it thinner. So instead of doing this, we can, again, control click and drag here. All right, so that roughly lines up. And then we can define our point here by using multi-cut. Right, so click on multi-cuts, control click here, and we can get a preview and then just drop that down. So that's where this starts to taper to a point. And then at the bottom, we can scale this down, and we can move it over. So. And we need another edge loop here to define this curve, so we can add that. So again, control clicking. And then you can also scale the vertices, right? So that's scaling the vertex. And then for the top, we can go ahead and create this nail head that we see here. So that's the top of this this tack right here. So let's do that in perspective. And the way that we create this is we can actually bring these up a bit. So I'm going to bring those up. And then I'll use multi-cut and insert an edge loop here. And then what we want to do is select all these faces that go around in a loop. All right, so if I hit Q and then go to face mode, you can select and drag, right? But sometimes, if you don't do this perfectly, you'll accidentally get a wrong face. All right, so another way to select a loop of faces is if you click one and then hold down Shift and double click. That way you'll get a whole loop of these faces. And what we want to do is extrude. Right, so the extrude tool is over here in the modeling toolkit. So I'll hit extrude. And it doesn't do anything at first. You get this little window, and then you get a manipulator. So one way to do this is if I drag on the blue handle, we can extrude the faces outward, like so. Okay. Another way is that we can use this thickness. So that does a similar operation. But I think we'll just do this. And it's a little hard to see because of the image plane, but you know, if we hide that, and again, this is inside the handle, right? So we can hide the handle by hitting H, and we can see this this head. So that's pretty good blocking shape for the tack. Now, if we want to refine this, again, we can do our smooth mesh preview. So if I select this and hit 3, we'll see that it smooths the mesh, but it's changing the shape. And the way that we fix that is that we need to prepare the mesh for subdivision. Right? So we can see an example here where this edge loop, if I hit 3, it's winding up down here, right? And if I hit 2, I'll go into X-ray, you can see the original edge loop, and then it winds up down here, and that's due to the way that it's being smoothed. So what we want is for it to sort of stay up here, and we can do that with 2 ways, right? One way is to bevel. The other way is to put in a supporting edge loop. Right, so if I hit 1, we'll go back to the regular display. And to insert a supporting edge loop, you can use multi-cut. Right, so if you control click here, and also here, these are called supporting edge loops. Right, so they support this original edge loop and help it to stay put. So now if I hit 3, you can see that shape is retained a bit more. Right, so even though this edge moved down, this is one of the supporting ones. So the original one stayed pretty close to where it's supposed to be. Now the other way to do this is using bevel. Right, so if I delete these using Control Delete, if I select this and bevel, we'll get, you know, a very similar result. All right, so these 2 edge loops are supporting the original one. All right, so if I smoothen that, now we get something that looks correct. So those are 2 methods. It's supporting edge loop and bevel. I prefer to use bevel when I'm hard surface modeling because it lets you really define the shape in a way that I think is accurate to the way things are manufactured. But they're both valid, and people do have preferences there. So you can try both of them, but I would encourage using bevel for this. So that's one bevel. We can see that we need to add more, right? So the top needs to be more flat. So we can select both of these loops here and hit bevel. And again, we can adjust this down. It's a little sharper. And then for the bottom, this isn't too bad, but I think this is becoming too curved now. So I think for this, what we can do is just insert an edge loop here. So now if I smooth it, we get a little bit more of an angle at the bottom. And again, this is 1, and then this is 3. So that's our nail to the tack. Okay, so now that we've blocked in our handle and pin, And we've done our basic refinement. We want to go through and see if there's any last sort of cleanup steps or anything else that we need to do. So we can go ahead and hide our image plane. And if I just take a look at the handle, one thing we want to look out for is these elongated faces. Right? So we can see these are very long. And this can be fine in certain situations, but as a general best practice, what we want is faces that are relatively square. And one reason for this is that if we ever want to sculpt an object in ZBrush, it's really, really good or even necessary to have this kind of square topology. Another reason would be if you're rigging something and it deforms, having square topology is really, really good for that as well. So the way that you fix this is by adding edge loops. And you can go in and multi-cut. Right, so that's one way. Another way is if you select one edge loop, or you can select all of them. There's a tool here called Connect. And by default, that's going to give you one segment, but if you middle click and drag, you can control how many segments you want. So if I just kind of look at this from the front, if I drag this, if I go to 9 segments, that'll give us roughly square topology. So that's how you would sort of deal with those elongated polygons. Now, the caveat to that is if you're modeling for games or if you care about poly count, then you might want to have less of these edge loops. But many times in film, we don't really care that much about poly count, so we'll tend to do this kind of operation. Another potential cleanup is if you look at an area like this, we would tend to want to insert an edge loop on the middle of this. And that can come in handy when we do something called UVs, which we'll talk about soon. So to do that, you can multi-cut. And if you hold down Control and then Shift, you can get a perfect 50%. So that's how we deal with that. And then another area that can often be cleaned up is triangles. Right, so sometimes when you smooth an object that has triangles, you'll get an artifact. Right, so you'll get like a pinched point at the top. So one way to deal with that is, if I go to top view, we can select every other edge, like so, and we can delete. And that will get you what looks like a triangle, but it's actually a polygon. Right, so this is now, instead of a triangle, it has 4 edges. And this is somewhat optional. Some people get really kind of particular about this. Personally, if it's a flat area, and if I smooth the object by hitting 3, if I don't see any artifact here, I'm probably just going to leave these triangles. But again, that's kind of a personal preference, and there's different opinions about that one. So I'll just go through and maybe cut these, and then these triangles we would want to make smaller. They're a bit too big, so we can do that. We hit multi-cut. Again, this doesn't work on triangles, but if you just do it right here, you can scale these in. And that's one way to divide this. Right? You can multi-cut again. So we're after, relatively square, even topology. So again, these could be divided like so. And I think that's about it. So that handle is pretty good. If we go out of isolate, we can do the same thing to the tack here. So for these, you only have to select one edge, and then you can use connect. And we don't have to get them perfectly square, right? But you would want to get something like that. And again here, maybe for that one, we'll just do 2 or 3. So, and then for the top, maybe we'll just do a single one in the middle, like that. And then again, when you see this kind of shape here, where we have a strip of polygons that defines a cylinder, we would always want to place an edge loop in the middle of that. And this comes in handy when we do UVs quite often. All right, so there's the tack. Again, we can double check these by hitting 3. And they should look as we expect. So when we hit 3, this is essentially what it's going to look like when we render it. So we want to check this carefully and make sure it's good. Another thing we can do at this point is we can look at naming our objects in the outliner. So if we look at the outliner here, we can see that these are called polycylinder 1 or p-cylinder 1 and 2. Right. So we want to always sort of name things as we go. Right. Or you can do it at the end, but a lot of times it's easier to do it as you go, and then it's a way to stay more organized. All right. So if we double click here, this this can be called handle. And then this one, we'll just call this tack. Right. And then another thing we can do is these are both objects in the outliner. But what's really good is to group them, right? So if I select both of these and hit Control G, that'll create a group. And we can give this a name as well, right? We can call it thumbtack. And one thing to understand is when you select this, if we go to the channel box, the group node has transform. So groups are a really good way to transform a whole bunch of objects together. Right. So if I wanted to move this thumbtack around, even though it has 2 pieces, I can move the group. Whereas if I move the handle, then I would have to move both of these at once. But a lot of times it's easy to group things and then move them around. And you can create, for more complex objects, you can create entire hierarchies in here using the outliner. Okay, let's take a look at assigning materials in Maya. So by default, if you go to the attribute editor, so I'll just select the handle. If we go all the way to the end here, all these tabs, there's this something called the initial shading group and the standard surface 1. And another way to do this is if you open the hypershade here. So by default, when you open Maya, you get Lambert 1, and then there's a particle cloud and shader glow, and then a standard surface. So in any case, these are the default materials. And they give a very sort of basic shading that has, highlights and shadows and midtones, right? So it lets you see the surface of the object. But when we're modeling, we can assign some different materials that kind of indicates, what the object is and just give us a little more information. So to do that, you can right click and then do assign a new material. And there's a couple options here. You can do your Lambert, or if you want to see more of a specular highlights, you can do what's called a blend. So I think we'll just create a blend here. And you can give it a name if you want, right? So this could be, handle material, or like clear plastic material. And if you select it, it's a little smaller. And if you go to the attribute editor, you can change everything about the material, right? So if we want, we can make this more transparent. And this is kind of handy because we can actually see the tack inside now. And that's kind of useful in a lot of situations where you have one object that's hidden inside of another glass one, plastic. So that could be our plastic material, and then we can make another one for this. All right, so assign new material, blend, and then this could be metal material. And for this guy, we could make it a little darker, and then the specular color could come up. And you can play with all these different settings. So that could be metal material. All right, so that's how we assign materials. Another useful thing is we can use materials to check how clean our surface is. So if we just assign that metal material to everything, and then if we hit 3, this actually gives us a really good view of how smooth the surface is, and then it also lets us see our bevels. And we talked about beveling things as a way to add realism. And one aspect of that is that we get these nice glints here. So we're getting this little glint or highlights where that bevel is. And that's a really nice way to add realism to your models. So checking that with a metallic shader like this is a really good practice. Also, you can watch out for any artifacts in your surface. Right, like we talked about, sometimes we'll get rid of these triangles here. So if you see pinching here, if I can move that up a little bit, you can check for that. And there's just a hint where you can kind of see those triangles. And you'll get that much more on a curved surface. Since this is relatively flat, it's probably fine, but yeah, so there you see it. So if I move that up, you can start to see the triangles in here. And hopefully that comes through over the compression. I'll try to move it up even further. There you can really see, you can see these kind of light and shadow triangles. And again, you can fix that by deleting, every other edge. All right, so that could be a little better. It's still a little funky, but in any case, this is flat and it looks fine. So this should be good for this model. There. Another helpful thing is we can see the highlight here no matter what, because the default light in Maya is a headlight. Another thing we can do is add a light, right? So if we go to create, lights, we can add a directional light. And you see it created here. There's an icon. And if you hit this button, you'll actually get lighting. And you can turn on shadows as well, if you want. And now we can actually rotate this light around. And we can view the object this way. And this is another really good way. It's just to kind of check your surface quality. Okay, let's talk about UVs. This is actually one of my favorite subjects, even though a lot of people hate UVs. I think they're very relaxing. UVs have to do with the way that textures are displayed on the surface of a model. And it's a little complicated to understand, but we'll go through it, and I think it's easier if you just get in there and start creating them. So to get started, what you can do is pull up the UV toolkit. All right, so it's very similar to the modeling toolkits, but these are tools that are for UVs. And if you just sort of unfold some of these rollouts, so these are the tools that we use. It's also useful, I tend to split my view in half. And by default, this is looking at the front view here. But if you go to panels, and then under panel, you can go down to the UV editor. Here. So this is the UV editor window. And I also use a shelf for this. And I would highly recommend downloading this and installing it. This really makes things a lot easier. I'll go through some of this stuff as we go along. So to get started, we want to just sort of make sure our geometry is ready for this. One thing to do is, if you look at the channel box, you can see all the history here on both objects. We want to delete all of that history. If you don't, you can get some crashing when you go to unfold your UVs. So the way that you delete history is you can select both objects, and then if you go to edits and then delete by type, it's history. Or I would recommend just using a shelf button for this. Right, so that will delete your history. Right, so we get a clean sort of history-free model to start with. The other thing you want to do before you start is make sure when you look at the channel box, this is the transform info. And you really want to make sure that, especially the scale, doesn't have numbers in here other than 1. Right, so this has a scale in X of 2.382. And what this is going to do is it's going to mess up the what we call the textile density of the UVs. Right, so the textures would display at the wrong size relative to other objects. So what you want to do is clear this out. And one way to do that is if you right-click in here in the channel box, you can go to freeze and then freeze all. Okay. Now, I always use shelf buttons for these kind of things. So if I select this, I can just hit freeze, and that'll freeze everything. So after you delete history and freeze your transforms, you're ready to start UVing these two objects. Just to demonstrate what we're trying to do here, I have a couple of texture maps. Right, so this is just a tileable brick image. Right, so we're going to assign this as a texture and a material to the object. And I'll show you what it looks like now when prior to doing UVs. And then we'll sort of talk about what it'll look like after we unwrap the object. So to do this, We already assigned a clear plastic material, but let's just assign a new one. So you can right-click and then do Assign New Material. And for this, it doesn't really matter what it is. We can use a Lambert. And it starts off just being this white color. And the attribute editor sort of pops up. Now, there's a lot of tabs here because we have history. So you can sort of scroll through to the end. You can use your mouse wheel. If you go all the way to the end, you can see this Lambert 2 that we created. The other way to view materials is through the Hypershade window. So if you go up here at the top, you can click this button, and this will open up Hypershade. So the one that we just created was Lambert 2. If you want to select an object and then figure out what material is assigned, you can hit this button here to graph materials, and we get the Lambert 2. If we want, we can rename this material. So this can be brick. And we can assign a map to it. Right, so if you select the material and then go to the attribute editor, there's an attribute called color. And if we click here, we can select a file. Okay. And the file node comes, you can see this in Hypershade. And there's also this place 2D texture. So if we go to the file, it comes in blank, so we just have to open the image. So if we go to a brick, hit open. And as long as you have this little button checked, if you don't see anything, just hit this textured view, and you'll see the brick pattern coming in. So to start, it comes in very big. This is based on the scale of UVs. What we want to do to see this better is to select this Place 2D texture node here, and we want to change the tiling. And to do that, we can change this repeat UV. So if we raise this up, so maybe 16 and 16, we'll start to see how this this brick map is tiled onto our object. And the way this is displayed is based on the initial UVs that came with the cylinder. Right, so if you create a cylinder, this comes with a UV mapping here. Right, so we can see this. If I assign the brick texture to this, or the brick material to this, you can see that we do get a display here. But you can see it looks good on top, but on the sides, it's stretched. And if we were to select what we call a UV shell here, and then scale this, we can see that that's affecting the way that the map is tiled on the surface. Now, this object is a little different because we've done some modeling operations. We can see that the map kind of looks okay for the main cylinder part, the middle, but the top and the bottom are very just sort of distorted. And the point of doing UVs, right, of unwrapping our UVs, is to remove distortion. Right, so that's the primary goal: is remove the distortion and enable the display of textures to be correct on the geometry. So we can see on the bottom here, this is distorted as well. So another way to view this is, instead of using a brick pattern, we use what's called a checker map. So if you select your object, Maya comes with a checker map. In the UV editor, there's this little checker button. So if you hit that, it'll override your texture in the material with this kind of grid with numbers. All right, so that's the Maya checker map. Most of the time when we're using a checker map, we use maps that artists have created for this purpose. So I'll show you a couple examples of this. So this is a pretty famous one here. So this is a UV checker map. And this is one that I've created here. And let's go ahead and assign this. So if we go back to our material, so if you right click and do material attributes, and then we'll just go to that file. So instead of the brick, we'll just plug in that UV grid. We have to turn this off over here. So now it's much easier to see the distortion. The Maya one's a little hard to see because it comes in very large. So this is the distortion here. You can also change the tiling on the map. If you go to the channel box, this repeat U and V, if you change this, the texture map will be repeated more times. And you can adjust this based on your model to see the distortion. All right, so this is very useful. We'll keep this assigned while we're doing UVs. I have a shelf button that's really good for this. So if I click here, it just brings in a UV material that has that checker map already there. So this kind of just makes it easier to assign this. So we'll assign to both. And then I'll go ahead and change the tiling. So again, repeat U and V, we can just decrease that a little bit. And I'm just middle click dragging in the viewport to increase that. So if we change it to something like 10 or 12, it's giving a better display. All right, so let's go ahead and unwrap our UVs. So we can start with the handle. I'll just isolate this. And these are the default UVs that we get with the cylinder again. And we actually want to get rid of these. And we want to make sure that the entire object has UVs to start with. The best way to do that is to do a camera projection. So I have a shelf button here that does it. If you want to find it in the menu, it's under UV and then camera based. Right, so you can click there, or if you click this button, you get a camera-based projection, and it's just based on wherever your camera is at in the viewport. And it doesn't matter where you put this. You can look at the object from any angle or distance and just hit this button. And that's just the first step that gets us UVs for everything. And you can see what they look like in the UV view, right? So it kind of looks like a camera sort of snapshot of our object from a certain angle. And what we want to do at this point is go in and cut UV seams so that we can unwrap the object. So if you sort of imagine this object as being made of paper, and then if you were to cut it with an X-Acto knife in a certain pattern, and then if you were to lay it out flat on a table, that's what we're doing when we unwrap UVs. So to see this a little better, we can hide our grid pattern. And one way to do that is just to click this button up here, and that gets you a default material. So this is a default material. And there's a display mode which is helpful for this, which is to use the texture border edges as well as the soft edges. And this is determined by the normal values that we talked about earlier. So if I hit soft, we get this dotted line for each edge. And this lets you see where the UV seams are located more easily, right? And then we have texture border edges. So if I go in and select an edge loop here, so I've double clicked, and then we just want to cut that edge loop, right? So in the UV toolkit, this is under cut and sew, right? So this would be cut. And to create this shelf, I've essentially dragged this, copied it over to the shelf. Right, so if I hit cut, we can see that instead of a dotted line, we now have this, this solid white line. So the reason that I hit the soft display is so that you can see what you're doing easily when you're cutting edges. And the reason I've cut here is that we now have a UV shell that is flat. Right, so if I right click and go to UV and then UV shell, we've now cut the object into two different continuous groups of faces, right? And these are called UV shells. Right, so that's one, and then this is another one. And we can do the same thing on the bottom, right? So if I cut here, and you'll notice we're cutting along our bevels, right? This is one of the reasons we use a fraction value of 2, or a segment value of 2. So if I cut this one, so now we have another shell. And if you move it in the UV view, you can see that it's disconnected. And then the next thing we want to do is we can cut along this bevel as well. Right, so we'll cut here. And that creates yet another shell, like so. And then we can start to think about unwrapping our object. So I'll show you what happens when we unwrap. And if I click here again, we can see our UV grid texture. And we can sort of pay attention to how distorted this is. But if I select this UV shell here, and in the UV toolkits, we can go to unfold. Right, so unwrap or unfold is what this is. So if I click here, it's going to unwrap the UVs in a way that our texture map is no longer distorted. So you can see if I undo that, we went from a very distorted texture. And we can see the way it looks here. This is like a squashed cylinder. This is based on how our camera was looking at the object when we did our camera map. So again, if I hit unfold, we now get a very disc-like UV shell that doesn't have distortion. Another way to visualize this is if we just turn off our checker map, there's a button in here called UV distortion. So this gives you a heat map of the distortion in your model. Right, so blue areas are compressed, red areas are stretched. And if we look at this shell, if we unfold it, it will turn white. So white means that it's not distorted. Right, so it's not stretched or compressed. So the goal of UVing is to get all of our UV shells to be undistorted like this. So we can go one by one, or we can just select all of them. And you always want to save before you do this. And delete history. So I'm going to go to UV shell and just select all of them. Right? You can drag over. And I'll just hit unfold. And again, I have a shelf button for this right here. So I'm going to hit unfold. And it unfolds the model. So the bottom is now looking pretty good. Right, so that's perfectly unwrapped. But we can see from our heat map here that we have a lot of distortion along this main part. And that's because we haven't finished cutting our UV seams. So this is a cylindrical shape, and we need to cut it like we're cutting with an X-Acto knife along one of these edge loops. Okay, so I'm just going to hide this for a minute. So again, we can see our UV seams in white. And what we want to do is just pick an edge loop in here. And we can either double click or we can use a constraint. We don't want to cut these edges. We just want to cut up to this white line. So if you click here, and then if you shift and double click, you can sort of select a continuous edge loop. And then we can just continue clicking, or you can shift and double click and just get this entire edge loop along this UV shell. Right. Another way to do this is using a constraint. So in the UV toolkit, you can do selection constraint and then UV edge loop. So now that'll give you an auto selection, which is very useful for selecting edge loops. So I'm going to select that and then just hit cut. And now we get this white line where we've cut our UV seam. Okay. So if we go back to our heat map here, and we can select our shell, and again, save, delete history, and we can unwrap. And there we go. So it unwrapped that cylinder into a flat, sort of paper-like shell that we see here. And it's removed a lot of the distortion. So if we look now at our texture map, and I'm going to make this a little bigger. So repeat UV, we'll just do like 4 and 4. So you can see now that the squares that make up the checker map are no longer distorted. There is a bit of distortion here, right? So you can see where it says I and H. These boxes are supposed to be square, and they're a little bit wider here. And the reason is that it's trying to account for this shape, right? So it goes from being a cylinder here, and then it kind of flares out at the top and bottom. So one way to improve our unwrapping is that we can make more cuts. Right, so if I cut here, like so, again, we get that solid white line. And I can also cut at the bottom. So, cut. So now if we unwrap this again, so I'll go to UV shell, and I'll just grab, now we have 3 shells here, so 1, 2, 3, and I'll unwrap. So now we're getting something that has even better unwrapping and less distortion. And these are still at an angle, and that's because if you look at our UV shell, and you can rotate these, it's not, straight up and down. So you can fix that by selecting one of the edges in the middle, and then there's this tool called Orient to Edges. So if you click there, it's going to line that shell to those edges. And then you can also rotate, right? So if we look at the letters in the arrows, these are meant to indicate how the shell is oriented in UV space, in the UV editor. So if we want these to be up and down correctly, we would want to rotate. So there's a tool for this, right? So under Tools and then Rotate, you can click these until they're lined up. And you can also rotate, the shell manually, right? Or again, we can select that middle edge and And I have a shelf button here so we can align to edges, orient to edges. So it's perfectly straight up and down in the back, but where our cut is, it's at an angle. And that just has to do with the fact that this cylinder is a little bit flared out at the bottom. We can continue to look for distortion, and we can continue cutting seams and unwrapping. So if we look at this shell here, so this one looks white, but it is actually distorted. All right, so you can see there. This is like a ring shape, and what we need to do to unwrap it is cut it along one of these vertical seams. So if we select one of these and then hit cut, you can see that that UV cut line right there. And if I unfold it, you can watch what happens here. So it goes into this strip, right? So that's much more correct. And we actually have UVs that wrap around this the shape, the ring shape. And we can improve this even further. So one of the reasons we cut in this edge loop is so that we can select it. And then you can use a tool in here to straighten the shell. Right, so that's in the UV toolkit. And that'll get us something that's much more like a strip, like a straight strip. And if we rotate this, this gives us UVs that are aligned along that shell. Now you can see it's a little bit smaller in the middle and sort of flared out. If we want to fix that, we can try to optimize. Right, so optimize is similar to unfold. So if we unfold, it goes back to this shape. But if we optimize, it'll use a different algorithm to try to remove distortion. And optimize isn't doing much in this situation, but we can select the UVs here, and we can try to use this tool called straighten UVs. So that will try to align them all to a grid. All right, so if we hover over this, it kind of gives an explanation. So straighten UV edge loops along U and or V. That gives us a much cleaner sort of rectangular UV shell. We can try the same technique for this main part of the cylinder. So we had this, straight up and down UV shell in the back, but here it's tapered, right? It's running into the seam. So this is the UV shell. And if we select all the UVs, you can double click to do that. We can try again and do this straighten UVs. And again, that worked pretty well. So now we actually have more distortion, but we have a cleaner layout. And it's much easier for a texture artist to apply a tile texture to this and get it to run straight without being slanted into the seam like that. Now we can look at our other shells as well, right? So this is sort of the top of this this handle. And if we look, we do have a UV seam right here. And sometimes when we cut these, we can go back and see if those are really necessary. And if they're not, we can sew them back together. The way that you sew is the opposite of cutting. And I have UV edge loop on. If you keep this on, it actually gets the entire shell border, which in this case we don't want. So we can turn that off. I'm hitting Control-Shift, right-click, and then there's a selection constraint. So we'll just turn that off. And we just want these 4 edges. And you'll notice as we select them, it's selecting 2. And that's because these are the same edge in 3D space. So even though there's 2 edges in the UV editor, these are actually the same edge here. So when we sew them back together, and there's a button for this in the UV toolkit, which is sew. If we sew these together, it merges them together in the UV view. So we want to select this whole cut edge, right? So it's 4 edges. And if we hit sew, it'll sort of bring them together. And then we can unwrap the shell again. So I'll select it, and we can see the distortion there. And then if I unwrap again, we get something that's kind of like a donut. And we can look at our UV grid and distortion. And you'll notice this shell is very similar. So that is the bottom. So we just need to select these in the UV view. And you have to remember to get these little tiny ones where the bevel is. And another way to select that is if you drag over like this, and then you can control drag and deselect. And again, it selected both edge borders along the shell. And we can merge those together. And then we select the shell and unfold. So at this point, we've unwrapped all of our shells, and we need to arrange them within a square. And we can do that using UV layout. Right? So this is a tool in the UV toolkit. So we can do layout. And one issue is that if we look at our UV texture map, we can see that some of the letters are very big and then some of them are small. And we can exaggerate that, right? So if I select this shell, and if I scale it up, we can see that the texture gets smaller and smaller. If you scale it down, it does the opposite. Right? And what we want to do is we want to get all of these letters to be the same size. And the terminology for that is called textile density. Right? So textile density is a measurement of the amount of UV space that a shell or a component like a face has. The UV toolkit has a tool for measuring textile density. So if you select a shell, like we'll select this one, you can hit this button called Get, and it calculates a number, right? So this was 42.2695. And let's say you want to copy this textile density to all the other shells. You can just select everything and hit Set. And what that does is it'll apply the same textile density to everything. And you can see now that all of the letters are the same size. And this is one of the primary reasons that we use the checker map, is that we can visually check that textile density is correct. If we don't do this correctly, what happens is, let's say this is scaled down. We would wind up with a relatively sharp texture map on the object, but then in this area, it would be very blurry. And that's very, very noticeable when we do our rendering. So we definitely want to make sure all the textile density is the same. So once we sort of unify that, we can, again, organize our shells. So if I select everything, and we can do a layout. So this makes sure nothing is overlapping. Right? And there are some settings in here that you need to check. Right, so it's under Modify and then Layout. You can click this little box, and this will open the options. So what you want to make sure of is a few things. You want to turn rotation off. So pre-rotation and pre-scaling should be off. And then you want to translate the shells, but we don't want to rotate them, right? So if we remember when we rotated this guy, we did that in order to line up our letters to the world space. If you leave on the rotate, it'll mess that up. So we want to make sure to change away from the default option and turn off rotate. But we do want translate to be checked. And then very important, so shell padding and tile padding. If you zoom in really closely, we want there to be space between the UV shell and the border of the UDIM. Right, so again, this is UDIM 1001, the first UDIM. And we don't want this the shell to be right on the edge. Otherwise, that'll cause problems when we go to texture an object in Mari or Substance Painter. This can cause an error, and you'll actually wind up, it'll try to export this UDIM. Right, so you don't want that to happen. So when you set this to 1 or 2, you'll get a little bit of a buffer there. Right, so if I lay it out again, oops, like so, you get that little gap there, which is good. You also want a gap between your shells. So leave this to 1 or 2. So that's the layout UV options. I'm just going to hit close. Oh, we also want scale to be off. If you change this, this will change your textile density, and we actually want to set this manually. So set scale mode to off. So we have a layout. We can take our shells, and we can either leave them the way they are, or we can scale them. If we had other objects that were a part of this thing, then we might want to make this smaller. You can also align it to the center if you want. So I've just held down X. If you hold down X, that'll snap to grid. Right, so you can snap it to the center. And then if you want the maximum amount of space, you can scale this up until the UV shells just fit inside the unit. So that's often what we want to do. If it's a small object like a thumbtack or a rivet or a screw, sometimes we'll actually scale this down and just put it in a corner like that. But for this exercise, we'll just maximize it like so. And this is a UV layout. If you practice this, you can get very, very quick at it. And again, if you get this shelf, this makes things a lot easier. And the way these are laid out is essentially an order of operation that we just went through. So you do your prep work, delete your history, freeze your scale, set your display mode to soft, right? And your normal values. This brings in that UV checker material. And then you can do your camera based projection. Then after that, you do your cutting and sewing, right? And then unfolding and optimizing. And then after that is sort of aligning and rotating shells, and then doing your layout. So this is all in order of operation. It's really handy for anybody to grab these. I'll provide a link in the description. And to install the shelf, you just download it, and then you do load shelf. All right, so next we can just go through the same process again for the other piece of the object, right, the tack. So I'll just hide this by hitting H. And we can take a look here. Again, these are the defaults UV coordinates that came with the cylinder that we started with. So if we just sort of follow the shelf here, we can just make sure our history is deleted and freeze our transforms. And then we'll go to soft border display, and then make sure our texture borders are on, and make sure all of our all of our normals are soft. All right. And then we can do our camera projection. So again, it doesn't matter where your camera is. We're just going to hit this button. All right, it could be anywhere. And then I'll delete history again. It's good to sort of keep doing this as you go along. And then we can start cutting our scenes. Right, so that's the next part of the shelf. So I'll go to the default material. And we want to cut, this flat face. So I'll select these using that UV edge loop constraint, and I'll do a cut. And then you can do multiple at once, right? So I'll select here and then also here. Right, and we'll cut both of those. And then if we go down to the bottom, we don't need to cut this one. We just need to cut vertically. Right, so we can cut there. And then I'm going to select all of our shells. Right, so all. And then I'll just unfold. And then we can go ahead and do a layout. And we can see this shell is tilted, right? So we can fix that by selecting one of these edges in the middle or all of them and hitting this button. So this is orient shells to edge. Now we do have this this shell here that we need to cut as well. So you can do it in the 3D viewport, or I can select these edges by double clicking. So I'll cut there and unfold. And that gave us a pretty good strip that's straight. So we don't need to do the step of straightening UVs. But we can align this to edges, right? So if I select all these and align, there we go. And then we can select all these, frame them up, and do a layout. So there we go. And if we unhide our handle, again, we want all of these boxes to be the same size, right? So the same textile density. And we also don't want any overlap. So just to demonstrate this, so I'll just make these a lot bigger or smaller, just so we can see. So these now have two different textile densities, and we've already set it for this object. So what we can do is just copy that over to this one. So if we select one of these shells, or you can select all of them, and hit get, we'll get a number. So this was set to 42.9. Sometimes it makes sense just to set it to a round number, right? So we can just do 40. Set it to 40. And now we have more of a gap here. If you want, you can fix that. So do a layout, and then just select again, snap to the middle. And these are all sort of laid out. And we can select this object now. And if we select all of our UV shells, we still have this 40 number in the textile density tool. So if I hit set, it's going to match the textile density of both these objects. And your boxes should be the same as long as you remember to freeze your transform. Right? If this scale is wrong here, if this scale is a number other than 1, then this won't work. But as long as you freeze your transforms, you can set your textile density to match. And we can lay these out so they're not overlapping. And there we go. Now, we can either lay these out in the same UDIM, right? So 1001. Or what we usually do in VFX is we can offset these over. So if you hit your arrow keys, you can move these around by a unit. Right? So we can just put these in 1002. And it's pretty common to sort of organize this by material. So since we have this metal and plastic, right, we can have, you know, this plastic bit is in 1001, and then the metal is 1002. If you're doing this for games, this will all be very different. For games, textures are very optimized, so you'll tend to pack as many UDIMs as you can in a single UV shell or UV square. But for VFX, we don't care about that. We tend to separate things out more, and we organize them so that things are very convenient for the texture artist, and they can texture objects based on where they're located in the UV layout. If you want, you can go in and, you know, sort of customize this more, right? So let's say you wanted this shell, you know, to be located differently, or, you know, maybe you want it to be rotated like that. You know, you can do that at this point. That's up to you. And there we have it. So this is a pretty completed UV layout for this thumbtack. You always want to delete your history at the end, right? So it keeps all these UV operations that you've done. So you want to delete that, and then you get a nice clean object. And we can go back and assign the original materials. So this one had the clear plastic, and this one had the metal. Right. So this is now that brick texture. And you can see if we change the repeats, it'll you know, tile it more or less. And you can see that we've undistorted this brick texture map. Here's another one. This is a grunge pattern. So here's the finished object with UV layouts. And I hope you enjoyed this, and good luck.